December 7, 1941. Just before sunrise, as a pale grey light spread slowly across the vast Pacific Ocean and the world stood on the edge of a war it did not yet fully understand, the engines of Japanese carrier aircraft roared awake, cutting through the humid morning air like blades, and among the pilots preparing for takeoff was Kaname Harada, a young naval aviator whose heart beat with discipline, training, and an unshakable belief in duty, a man shaped by years of strict military doctrine, national pride, and the certainty that obedience was the highest virtue a soldier could possess. And as he adjusted his flight gear and climbed into the cockpit, he carried with him the weight of expectation placed upon every pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men taught that hesitation was weakness and mercy was betrayal, men trained to see the enemy not as human beings but as obstacles standing in the way of empire. And when Harada's aircraft lifted from the carrier deck and disappeared into the morning sky toward Pearl Harbor, he could not have imagined that this same sky would one day become the stage for a decision that would redefine his entire life. In those early years of the war, Harada was everything the Japanese military wanted him to be: precise, fearless, and unwavering, flying mission after mission with mechanical focus, surviving the chaos of Pearl Harbor and later the brutal air battles of Midway, where the sky burned with smoke and fire and the ocean below swallowed ships whole, and in those battles he watched comrades vanish in flames, saw enemy aircraft plunge into the sea, and learned quickly that survival depended on aggression, speed, and absolute loyalty to orders, and like so many pilots on both sides, he hardened himself, building emotional armor around his conscience because the alternative, thinking too deeply, questioning too much, was a luxury war did not allow. And yet even as the war dragged on and the losses mounted, something inside Harada remained quietly observant, a small, almost imperceptible awareness that lingered beneath the surface, waiting for a moment that would force it into the light. By the mid-years of the war, the Pacific had become a vast graveyard of metal and men, and Harada, now more experienced and more weary, flew patrols over endless stretches of ocean where the horizon seemed to dissolve into nothingness, where the line between sky and sea blurred into a single, merciless expanse, and it was during one of these patrols, on a day that began like countless others, with routine orders and familiar procedures, that Harada encountered a sight that would fracture the rigid framework of his beliefs, because far below him, scattered across the glittering surface of the ocean, were American pilots drifting beneath white parachutes, their aircraft destroyed, their weapons gone, their lives suspended between survival and death, tiny figures swallowed by the immensity of the Pacific, utterly defenseless. Harada circled above them, his aircraft casting a long shadow across the water, and in that moment the war seemed to slow, the roar of his engine fading into the background as his eyes locked onto the scene below, because these were not faceless enemies charging toward him with guns blazing, they were men clinging to life, men who had seconds earlier been locked in deadly combat and were now reduced to fragile human beings bobbing in the waves. And his training spoke first, loud and unyielding, reminding him of his orders, reminding him that enemy pilots were to be eliminated whenever possible, reminding him that hesitation could be punished by court-martial or worse. And yet another voice, quiet but persistent, rose within him, asking a question he had never allowed himself to ask before: what threat do they pose now? As Harada flew in widening circles, he could see the desperation in the movements of the men below, their heads tilted upward as they tracked his aircraft, unsure whether the next sound they heard would be gunfire or salvation, and in their body language he recognized something painfully familiar. The same fear he had seen in the eyes of Japanese pilots forced to ditch at sea, the same helplessness that stripped rank, nationality, and ideology away, leaving only the raw instinct to live, and for the first time since he had become a pilot, Harada felt the weight of a choice that no manual had prepared him for, because this was not a tactical decision, not a maneuver or a firing solution, but a moral crossroads suspended high above the open ocean. The war had taught him that victory demanded cruelty, that compassion was weakness, and that obedience was survival. Yet as he banked his aircraft and looked down again, he understood with sudden clarity that killing these men would achieve nothing beyond adding more ghosts to the water, more families left with unanswered questions, more lives extinguished long after the battle itself had ended, and his hands tightened on the controls, his pulse pounding not from enemy fire but from the realization that whatever he chose next would follow him long after the war was over, long after the engines fell silent and the uniforms were folded away. Instead of diving, instead of lining up his guns, Harada made a decision that defied everything he had been taught, everything the Imperial Navy demanded of him, and he flew lower, close enough that the men below could see the markings on his aircraft, close enough that they could read his intentions in his movements, and then, deliberately, he began to circle them, not as a predator, but as a guardian, using his aircraft as a visible shield, scanning the sky for other Japanese fighters that might appear, signaling with exaggerated maneuvers to indicate the presence of survivors in the water, and when distant shapes appeared on the horizon, rescue vessels responding to the signals. Harada remained overhead, refusing to leave, knowing that at any moment another aircraft could arrive and undo what he had begun. Every second he stayed increased the risk to himself, because if his actions were reported, if another pilot witnessed what he was doing and chose to speak, the consequences could be severe, and yet Harada remained, watching as the rescue ships drew closer, watching as ropes were thrown and exhausted men were pulled from the sea, watching lives that should have ended instead continue forward into an uncertain future, and when the last survivor was safely aboard, Harada finally turned his aircraft away, climbing back into the sky with a weight in his chest heavier than any he had carried into battle, because he knew, without doubt, that he had crossed an invisible line, one that separated the soldier he had been from the man he was becoming. The remainder of the war continued with its familiar brutality, and Harada returned to flying missions, returned to following orders, but something fundamental had shifted inside him, because once a man sees the enemy as human, the illusion that sustains endless violence begins to crack, and every mission thereafter carried echoes of that day over the ocean, echoes of parachutes drifting like fragile blossoms against the vast blue, and when the war finally ended, leaving Japan shattered and the world scarred, Harada emerged not as a triumphant warrior, but as a man burdened with reflection, a survivor forced to reconcile the actions he had taken and the ones he had refused to take. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes and the memories of war were passed down like inherited wounds, Harada chose a path that few expected of a former fighter pilot, dedicating himself not to glorifying conflict but to teaching its cost, speaking openly about the moment that changed him, about the day he chose mercy over obedience, and about the realization that true courage sometimes means defying the very systems that shape us, and as he stood before students, veterans and audiences across generations, he carried no weapon, wore no uniform, and claimed no glory, only the quiet authority of a man who had seen war from above and understood, too late for many but not too late for himself, that compassion does not weaken a warrior, it redeems him. June 5, 1942, late afternoon, as the sun hung low over the Pacific and the light began to soften, turning the endless water into a sheet of burning copper. Kaname Harada once again climbed into the sky, but by this stage of the war the air no longer felt clean or infinite, it felt crowded with ghosts, crowded with memories of burning carriers, shattered squadrons, and comrades who had vanished beneath the waves without graves or names, and as his aircraft cut through the thinning clouds, Harada carried with him not only orders and fuel and ammunition, but the weight of everything he had seen since Pearl Harbor, the brutal lessons of Midway where Japan's confidence had been shattered in fire and smoke, and the growing realization that the war he had once believed in so completely was consuming men faster than it could justify their deaths. The Imperial Japanese Navy still demanded absolute obedience, still spoke of honor and sacrifice, but the tone had changed, becoming sharper, more desperate, as losses mounted and victories became rarer, and pilots like Harada were no longer symbols of unstoppable expansion but tools used again and again to slow an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every engagement, and in briefing rooms thick with cigarette smoke and tension, commanders pointed to maps marked with red lines and arrows, issuing orders with voices that betrayed exhaustion, and Harada listened, nodded, and followed procedure. Yet inside him something had begun to fracture, because war had stripped away the illusions that once made obedience simple. It was during one such patrol, months after the incident with the parachuting Americans, that Harada found himself once again alone over open water, the vast Pacific stretching endlessly in every direction, a reminder of how small a single man truly was, and as he scanned the horizon, his eyes caught movement below, dark shapes against the shimmering surface, and his breath caught before his mind could fully register what he was seeing, because once again there were men in the water, American pilots whose aircraft had been torn apart moments earlier, their parachutes collapsing into the sea as they struggled to stay afloat, and time seemed to fold in on itself as Harada felt the memory of his earlier decision rush back with terrifying clarity, the same training pressing against the same conscience, the same impossible choice unfolding in the same merciless sky. This time, however, the stakes felt even higher, because Japanese aircraft were nearby, their distant silhouettes flickering in and out of the haze, and Harada knew that any deviation from orders could be witnessed, reported, punished, and yet the sight below him was undeniable, men waving weakly, some injured, some barely moving, all of them helpless, and in their vulnerability Harada recognized something universal, something that no ideology could erase, and he realized that the line he had crossed before could not be uncrossed, that once mercy had been chosen, it could not be undone, only reaffirmed or betrayed. He circled again, lower this time, close enough to see faces, to see fear etched into expressions no different from his own when his aircraft had taken hits in earlier battles, and he thought of his family back home, of his mother who believed he was serving honorably, of the quiet hopes she carried for his return, and he wondered how many mothers were now staring at empty doorways because of decisions made thousands of miles away, and with that thought, the war's logic finally collapsed. Entirely, revealing itself not as a noble struggle, but as a machine that devoured sons without mercy, and Harada made his choice once more. He flew deliberately, signaling again, widening his circles to draw attention, placing his aircraft between the men in the water and the direction from which other Japanese fighters might appear, his heart hammering not from enemy fire but from the knowledge that every second increased the risk of discovery, and when distant aircraft began to approach, he tightened his formation, staying visible, unmistakable, making it clear that survivors were present, forcing any arriving pilots to confront the same moral crossroads he now stood upon, and when rescue ships finally appeared, cutting through the water with desperate urgency, Harada remained until the last man was pulled from the sea, watching as enemies were transformed back into human beings before his eyes. When he finally turned away, the silence inside the cockpit felt heavier than any explosion, and Harada knew with certainty that the war had lost its hold on him, that he could continue flying, continue obeying, but he would never again believe without question, never again see the enemy as a faceless target, and as the months passed and Japan's situation worsened, that awareness became both a burden and a quiet form of resistance, shaping the way he spoke, the way he remembered, the way he survived the war not just physically but morally. After Japan's surrender, as the country lay broken beneath the weight of defeat and occupation, Harada returned to a civilian life that felt foreign and fragile, the roar of engines replaced by silence, the rigid certainty of military life replaced by questions he could no longer avoid, and while others clung to old narratives of honor and sacrifice, Harada chose a different path, speaking openly about what he had seen. About the moment he realized that courage was not found only in combat but in restraint, not only in loyalty but in humanity, and he dedicated himself to teaching peace, traveling, speaking, and reminding younger generations that war is not defined by victories and defeats, but by the choices individuals make when no one is watching. In classrooms and lecture halls, he spoke not as a hero but as a witness, telling the story of men drifting beneath parachutes, of a sky that demanded obedience and a conscience that demanded mercy, and he watched as listeners struggled to reconcile the image of a Japanese fighter pilot with the idea of compassion, and he welcomed that discomfort, because it meant the lesson was being felt, not merely heard, and in that way, Harada continued to save lives long after the war had ended, not by shielding men from gunfire, but by shielding minds from the seductive simplicity of hatred. August 15, 1945, shortly after noon, as radio signals crackled across the Pacific and the heavy air of a long, brutal war finally began to still, Kaname Harada stood on solid ground and listened as the words of surrender reached him, words that carried no triumph, no relief, only a deep, echoing finality, because for men like Harada the end of the war did not arrive as celebration but as silence, a silence filled with memories of burning skies, lost friends, and choices that could never be undone, and as the engines of war finally quieted, he felt the weight of everything he had carried since the first day he climbed into a cockpit begin to settle fully upon him, heavier now because there was no next mission to distract him, no orders to follow, no enemy to scan for on the horizon, only reflection. Japan lay shattered, its cities scarred, its people exhausted, and its warriors forced to confront the reality that the ideals they had been taught to defend had collapsed beneath the cost of human life. And Harada returned home not as a decorated hero welcomed by parades, but as a man moving through ruins both physical and emotional, watching civilians struggle for food, shelter, and meaning. And in their faces, he saw the same vulnerability he had seen in the men drifting beneath parachutes. Years earlier, the same quiet question etched into their expressions. Was it worth it? And he knew, with painful clarity, that the answer was far more complicated than victory or defeat. In the early post-war years, Harada rarely spoke of his time as a pilot, because the memories were too vivid, too sharp, and because the society around him was not yet ready to hear stories that did not fit neatly into narratives of honor or sacrifice, and yet the scenes replayed endlessly in his mind, the ocean shimmering beneath him, the white parachutes collapsing into waves, the moment his aircraft became a shield instead of a weapon, and he understood that those moments had spared not only the lives of his former enemies but his own humanity, because without them he might have emerged from the war hollowed out entirely, another man who survived physically but lost himself in obedience. As years passed and Japan slowly rebuilt, Harada found himself increasingly compelled to speak, not out of a desire for recognition, but out of responsibility, because silence, he realized, allowed the same patterns of thinking to take root again, the same dangerous simplifications that reduce people to symbols and enemies to abstractions, and when he finally began to tell his story publicly, it was not with dramatic flair or self-praise, but with humility, hesitation, and honesty, describing himself not as a savior, but as a man who hesitated long enough to see another path, and in classrooms filled with young faces who had never known war. He spoke of the sky not as a place of glory, but as a place where decisions were made in seconds and consequences lasted lifetimes. He told them about Pearl Harbor and Midway, about the discipline that shaped him, about the fear that lived behind bravado, and about the day the war stopped being a contest of nations and became a question of conscience, and he watched as students leaned forward, unsettled by the idea that heroism could exist in defiance, that courage could mean choosing not to fire, and he did not soften the lesson, because he wanted them to understand that compassion is not easy, that it carries risk, isolation, and misunderstanding, but that it also carries the power to interrupt cycles of violence that seem inevitable until someone chooses otherwise. Over time, Harada's story crossed borders, reaching audiences beyond Japan, including former Allied nations, and in those moments the full weight of his actions became clear, because among those listening were veterans, families, and even some of the very pilots he had once protected, men who had survived to build families, careers, and futures because a stranger in an enemy uniform chose mercy, and when Harada met them, there were no grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations, only quiet conversations filled with gratitude, disbelief, and shared recognition of how fragile life truly is, and in those encounters Harada felt a sense of peace that no military honor could ever provide. He never denied his role in the war, never attempted to rewrite history or absolve himself of participation in violence, because he understood that responsibility meant accepting the full truth, both the harm and the moments of humanity, and he spoke openly about the contradiction of being both a fighter and a protector, a participant in destruction and a witness to compassion, and in doing so he offered something rare, a story that refused simplicity, that acknowledged the complexity of human behavior even in the most extreme circumstances. As he grew older, Harada often reflected on how close he had come to living an entirely different life, one where obedience had erased empathy, where the war ended but the damage inside him never healed, and he knew that the defining moment of his existence had lasted only minutes, a brief window in the vast timeline of global conflict, yet it had shaped everything that followed, proving to him that even in systems designed to remove choice, choice still exists, fragile but powerful, waiting for someone willing to bear its consequences. When Harada eventually passed away, his story did not end with him, because it lived on in classrooms, documentaries, and conversations between people who might otherwise have seen each other only as descendants of enemies, and his life became a quiet reminder that history is not only shaped by generals and battles, but by individuals who, when faced with orders and opportunity, choose restraint over violence, humanity over hatred, and conscience over command. And in that sense, Kaname Harada saved far more than the men he protected over the Pacific. He saved a piece of what war so often tries to destroy, the belief that even in the darkest skies, compassion can still take flight. September 3, 1952, early evening, as the sun dipped behind the rebuilt rooftops of Japan and the long shadows of the past stretched quietly into the present. Kaname Harada stood before a small audience for the first time, not as a former pilot, not as a representative of a defeated nation, but as a man willing to speak openly about what war had done to him and what he had chosen to do within it, and his voice, though calm, carried a weight that came not from authority but from memory, because every word he spoke had been tested against the images that still surfaced uninvited in his mind: engines screaming over open water, tracer fire cutting the sky, parachutes drifting downward like fragile promises that might or might not be kept. And as he began to tell his story, he could feel the room grow still, the listeners sensing that this was not a tale of victory or loss but of reckoning. In the years since the war's end, Harada had come to understand that survival was not the same as peace, because while his body had returned intact, his thoughts often remained suspended somewhere over the Pacific, circling moments that could never be relived yet refused to fade, and he knew that many around him carried similar burdens. Veterans on all sides who learned to function in daily life while carrying entire battles inside their silence, and it was this shared, unspoken weight that compelled him to continue speaking, even when it reopened wounds he had worked so hard to contain, because silence, he believed, was how wars quietly prepared themselves to happen again. As Harada traveled from town to town, school to school, he encountered resistance as often as understanding, because some listeners were uncomfortable with a story that challenged deeply ingrained ideas about honor, obedience, and national identity, and there were moments when his words were met with skepticism, even anger, from those who believed that mercy toward the enemy weakened the memory of sacrifice. Yet Harada did not retreat, because he had learned that true strength did not lie in unanimity or applause, but in the willingness to stand by one's conscience even when it isolated you, and he spoke not to persuade but to testify, offering his experience as evidence that humanity does not disappear in war. It is merely buried beneath fear and doctrine. Over time, something unexpected began to happen, because among the listeners were younger generations who had grown up amid ruins but without first-hand memory of combat, and to them Harada's story did not sound like betrayal or weakness, but like revelation, a glimpse into a version of courage they had never been taught to recognize. And after his talks, students lingered, asking questions not about tactics or battles, but about fear, doubt, and the moment when he realized he could choose differently, and in their curiosity Harada saw hope, because they were not asking how to win wars, but how to avoid repeating them. His story eventually crossed oceans, translated into other languages, carried by educators, historians, and peace advocates who recognized its rare power to humanize all sides without erasing responsibility. And when Harada was invited to speak before international audiences, he felt the full gravity of what he represented, a former pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy standing before people whose families may have suffered under that very war machine. And yet again and again he found that honesty created space for understanding, because he did not ask for forgiveness, did not demand reconciliation, but simply offered the truth of his experience, trusting that truth to do its quiet work. One evening, after a lecture abroad, an elderly man approached him slowly, his movements careful, his expression unreadable, and when he spoke, his accent marked him unmistakably as American, and he told Harada that his brother had been a pilot shot down over the Pacific, that for decades the family had believed he was lost without witness or mercy, and that hearing Harada's story had forced him to imagine a different ending, one where his brother's final moments might not have been filled solely with terror. And as the man spoke, his voice faltered, and Harada felt the familiar tightening in his chest, because in that instant the abstract idea of lives saved became achingly personal, transformed from numbers and narratives into a single human connection spanning former enemy lines. Moments like that reinforced Harada's belief that his duty had not ended with the war, that in some ways it had only begun, because memory itself was a battlefield, one where simplified stories fought against complex truths, and Harada chose, again and again, to stand on the side of complexity, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it demanded vulnerability, and as the decades passed. His message remained consistent, shaped not by ideology but by lived experience, that war reduces human beings to targets, but individuals can still choose to see each other as lives worth protecting. As age slowed his steps and thinned his voice, Harada continued to speak whenever he was able, aware that time was steadily narrowing the distance between memory and history, and he worried not about how he would be remembered, but about what would be remembered in his absence, because he knew how easily narratives could harden, how quickly compassion could be dismissed as weakness, and how tempting it was for future generations to believe that they would act differently without ever being tested. And so he spoke until he could no longer travel, until his body insisted on rest, leaving his words to continue their journey without him. March 12, 1968, late afternoon, as a quiet rain fell over a small coastal town and the sound of waves echoed softly against the shore. Kaname Harada sat alone by a window, watching the grey light fade into evening, and for the first time in many years the memories did not arrive like sudden storms but like distant tides, steady and contemplative, because age had not erased what he had seen, yet it had given him the space to understand it more fully, to see his life not as a series of isolated moments but as a long, unbroken line shaped by a single decision made high above the Pacific, a decision that continued to ripple outward in ways he could never have predicted. By this stage of his life, Harada had become known not as a former fighter pilot but as a quiet advocate for peace, a man whose past lent weight to his words without the need for spectacle, and wherever he traveled, whether speaking to students, veterans, or ordinary citizens, he noticed the same reaction repeating itself. People leaned forward not when he spoke of Pearl Harbor or Midway, not when he described tactics or aircraft, but when he spoke of the moment he chose not to fire, because that moment forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth, that history is not shaped only by orders followed, but by orders questioned, resisted, or quietly ignored, and that the power to alter the course of a life, or many lives, often lies in seconds no one records. As global tensions shifted and new wars erupted in distant regions, Harada watched the news with a familiar heaviness, recognizing the same language, the same justifications, the same promises that violence would be brief, necessary, and controlled, and he felt a renewed urgency to speak, because he understood how easily societies convince themselves that humanity must be sacrificed for security, and how rarely those sacrifices are acknowledged once the fighting ends. And so he continued, even as his voice grew softer and his movements slower, believing that if even one person paused before dehumanizing another, the effort would have been worth it. Letters began to arrive from places he had never visited, some from young people questioning military service, others from veterans struggling with memories they had buried for decades, and among them were messages from families in the United States, written carefully, respectfully, expressing gratitude not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet astonishment that an enemy pilot had chosen mercy when no one would have blamed him for choosing otherwise, and Harada read each letter slowly, aware that these words represented lives that had continued, children and grandchildren born into a world that existed partly because a stranger had circled overhead instead of pulling a trigger. In private moments, Harada reflected on how easily his life could have followed a different path, one where obedience erased doubt and silence replaced reflection, and he knew that history would still record the war much the same way, battles won and lost, nations rising and falling, but something essential would have been missing, an example that proved individual conscience can exist even within the most rigid systems, and this realization brought him a quiet peace, not pride, but acceptance, because he no longer measured his life by medals or missions, but by the knowledge that he had preserved something fragile and invaluable in a time designed to destroy it. As the years continued to pass, Harada became increasingly aware that his generation was fading, that soon the war would exist only in books, photographs, and stories passed down by those who had not lived it, and this awareness sharpened his resolve, because memory, he understood, is easily reshaped when those who experienced events firsthand are no longer present to complicate the narrative, and so he spoke with care, emphasizing not heroes and villains, but choices and consequences, urging listeners to resist simple answers and to recognize that morality does not vanish in war. It merely becomes harder to hear. In one of his final public talks, delivered to a small audience, Harada ended not with advice but with a question, asking what each person might do if placed in a moment where obedience demanded cruelty and compassion demanded courage, and he left the question unanswered, knowing that its power lay not in guidance but in reflection, because no one can know how they will act until the moment arrives. Yet everyone can decide what values they will try to protect if it does. When Harada's life finally drew to a close, there were no grand ceremonies, no military honors, only quiet remembrances carried by those who had heard his story and allowed it to change them, and in the years that followed, historians would note his actions, educators would teach his example, and filmmakers would attempt to capture the weight of his choice. But none of those retellings could fully convey the simplicity of what he had done, because at its core, his legacy was not about defying orders or saving enemies. It was about recognizing humanity when it was easiest to deny it. And so the story of Kaname Harada endures, not as a tale of war, but as a reminder woven into the larger history of World War II, that even amid the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, and the machinery of destruction, a single pilot once looked down at the ocean, saw not enemies but lives, and chose to protect them, proving that compassion, once chosen, can outlive the war itself, and continue flying long after the skies have finally grown quiet. October 21, 1979, just after dusk, as autumn winds moved through the trees and the last light faded quietly from the sky. Kaname Harada sat among a small group of listeners in a modest hall, the room warmed by low lamps and the soft murmur of anticipation, and as he prepared to speak, he felt a familiar mixture of reluctance and resolve, because even after decades, telling his story never became routine, never lost its emotional weight, and perhaps that was precisely why he continued, believing that the discomfort it stirred was proof that the lessons of war had not yet been dulled by time, and that memory, when handled honestly, could still cut through complacency. By now, Harada was no longer viewed simply as a former pilot who had shown mercy, but as a living bridge between enemies once divided by oceans, uniforms, and ideology, and he carried that responsibility carefully, aware that his words were often interpreted as symbols rather than personal reflections, yet he resisted becoming a symbol himself, always grounding his story in the specifics of experience. The sound of engines, the glare of sunlight on water, the sight of human beings drifting helplessly below, because abstraction, he believed, was what allowed violence to repeat itself so easily, and specificity was what forced people to confront the reality behind slogans and strategies. In these later years, Harada often spoke less about the act of saving lives and more about the moment before it, the moment of hesitation that preceded choice, because he understood that most people imagined moral decisions as dramatic, instantaneous acts of courage, when in truth they often began with uncertainty, fear, and doubt, and he wanted his listeners to know that he had not felt heroic, had not felt certain, had not even felt brave, but had simply paused long enough to see the humanity in front of him, and that pause, he insisted, was something anyone could choose if they allowed themselves to question what they were being asked to do. As he addressed audiences increasingly far removed from the Second World War, people born decades after its end, Harada noticed how easily war had become history rather than memory, something discussed in terms of dates, battles, and outcomes rather than lived experience, and he worried that distance would turn suffering into abstraction, making it easier for future conflicts to be framed as necessary or inevitable. And so he described the war not as a series of turning points, but as a constant state of fear, exhaustion, and loss, emphasizing that no side emerged unscarred, and that every victory carried costs that extended far beyond the battlefield. In conversations after his talks, young people often asked him what he would do if placed in the same situation again, whether he believed everyone should act as he did, and Harada answered carefully, refusing to offer prescriptions, because he knew how dangerous certainty could be, and instead he spoke about awareness, about recognizing when orders collide with conscience, and about the importance of remembering that even in systems designed to suppress individuality, the individual still exists, still bears responsibility for their actions, and still lives with the consequences long after the system itself dissolves. As the world entered new eras of tension and technological warfare, Harada watched with concern as weapons became more distant, more abstract, allowing destruction to be inflicted without direct contact, and he feared that such distance made compassion even harder to access, because when the enemy becomes a blip on a screen or a statistic in a report, the moment of hesitation he had experienced might never arise. And this fear fueled his continued advocacy, because he believed that stories, especially those grounded in personal experience, could restore some measure of human connection even in an age increasingly defined by detachment. In quieter moments, Harada reflected on how his life had unfolded alongside global events far larger than himself, and how a single choice made in obscurity had come to define him more than any mission he flew or rank he held, and this realization humbled him, because it suggested that history's course is shaped not only by leaders and armies, but by countless private decisions made by individuals whose names may never appear in textbooks, yet whose actions ripple outward in unseen ways, altering lives and futures without fanfare. As his health declined and travel became more difficult, Harada gradually withdrew from public speaking, entrusting others, teachers, historians, peace advocates, with the task of carrying his story forward, and he did so with a quiet confidence that surprised even himself, because he had come to believe that the story no longer belonged solely to him, but to everyone who grappled with its implications, and that once shared, it would continue evolving in the minds of those who heard it, shaped by their own values, fears, and choices. In the final years of his life, Harada often returned in his thoughts to the ocean, to the way it had looked on that defining day, endless and indifferent, yet capable of reflecting both the violence and mercy of those who moved above it, and he understood then that the ocean had not judged him, had not rewarded or punished him, but had simply borne witness, as history itself does, recording actions without commentary, leaving judgment to those who come after, and this understanding brought him a sense of peace, because he no longer felt the need to explain or justify his choice, only to acknowledge it. And so, as the decades passed and the Second World War receded further into the past, Kaname Harada's life stood as a quiet counterpoint to narratives of inevitability, a reminder that even in the most rigid structures, humanity can assert itself, that even in wars defined by destruction, moments of protection can occur, and that even a single decision, made without witnesses and without applause, can echo across generations, shaping how history is remembered and how the future is imagined. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.